blowing perhaps in one's face sometimes, but nevertheless keeping whistling and keeping one's ear to the other whistles that are coming across. We grow up, of course, with some very strange ideas about things, and this slide and the next one fascinate me for that reason. They're Bruno Tart again, for whom I make no apology. And this is Bruno Tart as well. In fact, they're both drawings by Bruno Tart, and perhaps fairly similar. I mean, I'm no historian, but they're more or less the same period of his working life. And the first one always excites us, of course, because it was the glass pavilion, and it was, you know, Bucky before Bucky, and it had all those nice, energetic and technologic things going on in 1914, and we all know that first one, I presume. The second one, it's the same bloke, and it's the same plan. I mean, it's circular in its beehive shape, and it's sort of folksy, you know. So fingers to all that. Next slide. You know, what do we make of that? Because we've just geared ourselves up to this notion of, you know, right architecture at one period, or interesting architecture, and the same bloke is doing the opposite thing with the same shape. And you get undermined by such situations, because I'm fascinated by such undermining. This, which some of you probably already have heard me talk about, is again one of my favourites. So this first section is sort of favourites. Is the bar in Hamburg, where the shop window is the architecture. Not only is it architectural, but it's, you know, it's about the right size. And it can be replaced, you see, next month by a completely different architecture, which is just inserted into the shop window, which is quite nice, I think. One of the things that really worries me in the situation at the moment is our predilection for nostalgia, albeit that I've just been indulging, and will indulge perhaps for a further 30 minutes, in a certain kind of nostalgia. The nostalgia particularly characterized by us looking at our past. I get very sickened by the number of TV programs that are looking at the immediate or deeper British past. I think that those guys themselves wouldn't have been looking at the past, so why the hell look at their past? And my instinct is to sort of insert something into that V-sign. You know, I mean, I can't stand the reiterant V sign waiting to be exploded. And the thing then is overlaid by questions of strangeness. It's the strangeness of that landscape. A bit of it at the end, which I didn't show in the new section, is that confronted with an architecture hidden into that landscape of strange architecture, perhaps would lead us then to look at quite straightforward phenomena, such as the advent of trees in a line. Questioning it the second time, once we've been surprised or shocked or slightly unnerved, perhaps we look again at the culture around us. Perhaps when we've seen that Bruno Tart is capable of making a folksy extrapolation of his beehive, as well as a technological extrapolation at more or less the same time, we look more closely at not only our attitude towards these things, but towards the bloke himself. And so one's first thought is about invention, about culture, and about opportunism. And looking at the edges, always one has to look at the edges, and I think this business of whistling in the wind at this precise moment in history is of necessity a looking at the edges, and perhaps not looking too far behind. I'm sounding terribly moralistic, and I'll come on to some new drawings in a minute, and then I'll be on much happier ground. I found myself, this one's always reminded, and I found myself a few months ago in Edinburgh at an oil conference. And I thought this was a bit odd, me being at an oil conference and in Edinburgh, but anyhow, I was there. And there was this whole discussion, a lot of it highly moralistic, about, you know, the aim of Scottish oil, which is, I suppose, reasonable, since it sort of comes from up there. And that, you know, that there was a highly moralistic edge to all the conversations as to what was to be done with it. And I sat there, I was reporting it for a magazine, and so I had to sort of sit there and write everything down, like Martin's writing this down for a magazine in the front here. And it makes you sort of look at things in a, you gradually get more and more irritated. You sit there, and I was on about last. And I said, well, this is all very well, but let's have a look at some situations about oil. You know, I mean, I don't know how you get the stuff out, and I don't really mind whether the Scots have it or whether I wear it kilt so that I can go up there and have some as well, or, you know, I don't mind Scottish grandmother and all that. But let's look at this situation of the morality of certain ways of doing things. And I said, well, I'm just going to repeat it for you, because it's really what I feel about opportunism and architecture and moralities and all of that. So several things you could probably do with that oil. I mean, you could, and of course it's all to do with the Celtic Fringe. I mean, I'm fascinated by the possibility that in the next month or two we will be confronted with this fascinating situation where you get sort of the Europeans in their heavily laden and neurotic cities and all the rest of it, the ring starts and so on. And somewhere, morally and politically perhaps, and certainly in terms when it comes to architectural expressionism, there is what I call the Celtic Fringe, which includes Norway, Canada, and certain parts of Alaska, and a kind of perhaps strange situation somewhere around Bedford, in which the two sides, these will look from their very highly organized Germanic type cities, and the Celts in their holes in the ground with their useful oil and so on might do something else. Dennis, if you could just give me a bit more light, I'll make it. So I said, well now, okay, pan-Scottish oil. You could build a bloody great reservoir inside one of our very handy lumps. And nobody will know that the oil is there, but there it will be, of course, black gold and all of that, and you can do with it roughly what you do with whiskey already, which is to let it out in useful dribs and drabs at great cost. And this, from an economic point of view, and from a conservation, you know, you've got lots of mountains that you can dig holes in, we like the architecture of that kind of thing, and you have this hidden gold in a kind of, shall we call it, Celtic Fort Knox situation. So that's one thought. Second thought was that you say, well, okay, the oil will be manifest because, like the New Scottish Daily newspaper, it can be seen as a symbol of itself. And from its oil wells, it will come trickling, of course, in the valleys rather than in the hills, and through in kind of a nice, gentle, discreet, almost alternative technology kind of pipe. And at certain bands and whatever these things, things in the landscape that they have up there, it will outcrop, and perhaps you get a crofter who is just about to leave his croft, and in fact it becomes a useful sort of outlet inside, and so suddenly the traditional crafts can be reinforced, and I mean this quite literally, that instead of just lining the top of the croft again with a bit of old sort of asbestos sheeting, you can now have very highly finished asbestos sheeting, because you can use oil byproducts in the replacement and refurbishing of the old technology. So you get this funny jump. You get the old technologies, which are based on sort of presumably sticks and people spinning things, and you can impregnate them in this very cheap oil, which is coming up this discrete series of pipes. And so all sorts of marvelous things start happening. You get a rebirth of the clothespin industry with cheap oil byproducts. You get holes in the ground which are lined with tarpaulins, which can use oil byproducts and the whole thing. So you have, in a sense, a physical line, rather, I suppose, in historical terms, what the Nile is to Egypt. You have this physical phenomenon, which is itself a representation of both the thing of the future and the thing of the past. Now, if one could weld this together, it's not as, in a funny way, not as ridiculous as it seems. One has, in a sense, analogies with one's orchard idea, perhaps with a hedgerow. You have this discrete high-tech possibility infiltrating, creeping through your maintained old society, and all the formalities that might suggest. But then you could have a third alternative. You could have a less discrete line, which actually does still feed more or less the existing urban pressure points, and does actually have the pipeline, the feed, the line of this black gold, following more or less the existing pattern of where wealth is needed. So you have a sort of, it's a bit naive, but you have a sort of representation of Scotland as is. So Dundee has a big one spurting out here, and Bairn Cross or whatever it is has a very little tiny one. A fourth alternative might be that you see, cut the crap. If you could move the picture a bit. You've got Dundee, which is probably, as far as I know, the nearest place to which you get stuff coming in. And say, right, Dundee, which is it's got a few old stone buildings and hills and stuff, but basically it's a bit of a depressing place, let's face it. Make it into the real old-time oil king city, just like the Bahrains never quite made it. You make it really Dundee, this fantastic fun city, and it has fucking great things which perhaps look like Montreal towers, or certainly look like oil refineries. It's incredible. No, it's rather analogous again to the notion of the crater city versus the hedgerow village. That you cut the crap. You say, right, Dundee is where it's at, the closest place, and really reinforce it as the last dying embers of the 19th, 20th century city. And in Dundee, of all places, with its Puritanism. I mean, that fascinates me for a start. The fifth alternative is that you simply take the offshore. This is now a section drawing, or the more articulate. You simply say, well, it's so difficult to resolve these situations on land, and would constantly be squabbling, that the only thing to do is to build the place out where the oil is coming out. You don't just have one of these things, but you have the whole societal bit there, and the decisions, the people who work there have the whole thing that they might have had in Dundee, but actually where it's at. So it's territorially, shared. It's territorially disassociated, and Scotland can go on as it enjoys going slightly downhill forever. Much prefers going downhill to going uphill. I mean, that's why it's got all this nerve-wracking worry about itself, you see. And you know how cynical I am about these things. And one, in fact, makes it an extraterritorial city, whether it's floating or on pontoons, it doesn't really matter, you get the point. The fourth alternative is, well, there's another alternative. In fact, the oil that comes from here is then transported to the land in solid fuel packages, so that by the time it's disassociated from actually being this wicked black gold, it feels much safer. It's like, it's like decomposed chicken for a vegetarian. You don't quite feel so bad about it. The last alternative was quite simply to do the totally, if you're going to be moralistic about it, do the totally moralistic thing and let the fourth world have the oil, because after all, Scotland isn't that bad. If it isn't that bad, then it can't be that bad. What are you arguing about? Let them have it, then you don't have it on your conscience. Now you may say, Hiccup, you're being very ambivalent about this, you're being totally cynical. What do you really believe? Somebody here is going to say, but what do you really, okay, these are six sillies, but what do you really think? And I really think that any of them could be argued, you see. I mean, I really do. I think that in a funny way, dare I say it, I don't care which of them is argued. I mean, this one amuses me for certain reasons. that one amuses me less because we've been through that bit. But they're all 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. And my point is that we are so uptight about alternative strategies that might equally be viable. And in fact, my real proposition, this is the final proposition, that you don't do one and not the other. There are, if you remember, something like about 6 oil fields. So, underground, etc. Right? You pay some money and you take the choice. And you spend the next 50 years finding out who was right. I think it's a clue for some more music, actually. Button up the screen. Yes, we'll hear at the end what happened to the lady who discovered that live music was preferable. That record I like because it's very artificial. I mean, it's a sort of reincarnation of a not quite country and western, not quite 30s. It's sending itself up. It's making some analogy of live music to canned music. But the key thing about it is its artificiality, its syntheticness. And underneath all of this, certainly for the last 3 or 4 years, I've been fascinated by the idea of the artificial. Again, to use an overworked phrase, cutting the crap, getting down to the fact that architecture could be not making any concessions to being natural or reasonable or hairy or vernacular or useful material, but something other, really, really, really something other. So in a recent project, which I'm working on at the moment, one of the parts of that project, which is part of the drawing, is called sleek. It's a very difficult word to use. I don't have another slide. It's a difficult word to use because it cannot really be reproduced by architecture. I looked in the making of this drawing for things that I could use that had the quality of sleek that really I was trying to suggest, that had the quality of syntheticness, of such sheen. One can only borrow from, dare I say, the world of fashion or the world of terrible tactile conversations. But somehow could a building have the quality of the skin such that it's rather like a beautiful skin. It's so perfect that when you see the blemish on it, the blemish, as it were, accentuates the sheer quality of the thing. And the only, if we could push on a bit, the only examples I could find tended to be things like the tactile quality of satin as it drapes itself, or of cream poured, in this particularly gooey end. The quality of the cream as it folds, you can see it folding, dropping out this particularly unpleasant gooey jam. Again, the jam holding and folding. Or the quality, if you forget the automobile connotations, the quality that is sometimes possible in pressed metal. The cream rippling, the jam treacling, and the openness of the flake pastries. This is beyond architecture, it really is, and if one could only do it. If I could put down the slide. If one could do it, how? And you look at this sheet metal and you see how perhaps what is the nature of artificiality? Are we fighting away? Are we shying away from an incredibly magic situation, which isn't really to do with technology? I think the early archigram stuff is very much concerned with the mechanics of the thing, but the thing that I now feel that it was missing was this other thing, this strange architecture beyond the architecture that we know of an ability for the thing, whether we call it a building, whatever we call it, to be so far beyond one's experience of other objects and other circumstances that it is another thing again, such as one only gets when there is a major invention, I suspect. And I think Mike Webb, we nearly did his dream come true. Maybe we'll do that some other time again. But Mike is on to this ethereal quality of an architecture that is beyond architecture, and it makes all this silly quasi-strategic scribbling into just another old game. This question whether the thing is animal, mineral, or vegetable, whether it has a total topography or none at all, is secondary to still the inspiration, still the hope that somehow there is an architecture beyond the architecture that we know. And I get so absolutely irritated looking around this building at the number of projects that just go back to what we know. Okay, I believe in literacy, but it isn't enough. And I feel quite emotional about this. Is that the last one of that lot? Yeah. No music for the red one. And this question then of objects beyond the object. If you were looking closely at the thing called Cheap Marshall, which was our town as a funny place and you eat into the town and all that, you would notice that at the end, can't see red on red. You notice that at the end of it there was that the tower changed from being an orthogonal tower, eaten, then bent into something else, and then finally became, the metamorphosis of that particular part of the scheme became something other. And that, I suppose, was anticipating the lump. But at the same time, one at that point started to anticipate some way of making the nature of the building beyond not just the form, but beyond the substance of what buildings we've come to expect. And that, I think, is why, you know, that glorious little 3-year period when inflatables seemed to be so great. What was nice about inflatables was that they were popular and clever. Okay, every Tom, Dick, or Harry could understand them. Every architectural student could do them, and they seemed to be clever if you hadn't done one. And the final thing was they were unlike. They really, for a moment only, were unlike other buildings. You could look through them, and there weren't windows and bits of wood and metal and stuff. You could lean against them, and they had a responsive quality, a tactile quality, which buildings weren't supposed to do that. They could be smoky, they could go with the wind, they could be strange shapes, they could be like animals. And they didn't really get to this thing I'm hinting at, but they had some hint towards it. And that was magic, just for a moment. And then they became, well, of course, if you use the GRP welder with the reversed inlet seaming, you get a different than if you have that kind of entrance or that kind of entrance. Then you get back into the old thing again. I think we'll move on. And so it is no accident that in the work on this current project called Sponge, I'm looking again at tactile situations and working part situations, such as openings. This drawing is rather pompously called orifices. The transparency, translucency, density conversation, the unlike parts that are at the same time the same, and the surface that layers itself, that one looks, again, and a lot of architects in the past, of course, have done this, look at the way has looked at the way in which animals and fishes and natural phenomena have occurred. Next slide. For clues. But the problem about clues is that very often they lead backwards. And so it's with a sort of loving remembrance that one looks at people who looked forwards. And there's another preoccupation I find fascinating at the moment, this thing of physically beckoning. It's perhaps an art trick, but it's strange that Bel Geddes, when doing this Futurama thing, the most magic part of the Futurama scheme seems to be this entrance condition where people disappear into a place of mystery, this mystery thing, which one can't help coming back to. Or again, in Darmstadt, the most magic thing is the door. In an otherwise, if you forget the doily bit, fairly bland building. And again, it's this question of beckoning into another place that perhaps is far beyond anything that we've ever experienced. Maybe it isn't, maybe it's very ordinary when you get inside, but there's always the possibility. Whilst the possibility exists, I think there becomes a strange emotional thing that's set up by the making of such a door, the beckoning into Bel Geddes' future. And of course it can rapidly become an heroic experience, the processional, and then the whole backswage of culture is there behind you. You know, this whole tradition of ceremony and mystery and magic and style and art all coming together, and it borders up to another romantic thing. But no accident that in one part of the sponge project one has to put in, amongst the rest of this patchwork piece, an entrance of some formality, and one keeps doing the old traditional architectural thing of placing orifices in amongst other situations. So it goes roundabout. What is the effect of placing classicism upon these other ideas? I deliberately put that bit of Haydn in, which is so predictable after everything else that we've had, and yet has quality, but it's predictable. I mean, one can, I suppose, sit at the bath and make up bits of Haydn. It becomes, for me, immediately much more boring business than making up bits of Delius, because, you know, you can play your own game with Delius and it's all probably there somewhere. With Haydn, you play it by the rules, and only after 80 years do you extemporize at a rather higher level than you did, you know, 80 years before. In other words, what I'm saying, trying to use this musical analogy, is that there behind it all is the question of the classical approach to the problem. And now, next slide I think, now it can be disclosed that one in this current project is playing out a classical game. The sponge project I'm drawing in a series of consistent sheets. Each sheet has in the middle a pictorial view and around the edges supporting information. And my model is the 4 books of Palladio, where the various parts of the suggested architecture are placed, working part by working part. The doorway, the top, the edifice, the roof, the composition, and then finally, towards the end, the playing out of interpretations of that. And I'm doing exactly the same thing, dare I say it, with the sponge, which is to suggest the orifices, the insertions, the surfaces, the characteristics of the plan, and only maybe in about 2 or 3 months' time now will interpret it through to a working part building. Now, it amuses me to do this. I think you should see why I'm amused by the things that we've shown you so far, that perhaps it's a roundabout way of getting there. Perhaps it flies in the face of everything that you had thought Archigram was about. Perhaps it discloses once again, the paradox between one's instincts, which are to go beyond the the narrowness of architecture as we know it, but one's procedure, which is actually wishing to be a classic procedure of the method and the reference back. I don't know. There is, of course, another explanation, which is that it actually came out of the project, the sponge, came out of this scheme, which was a competition which we did with Cedric Price, Tony Dugdale, Per Cartvet. So it was a weird combination of people all working together. Nobody ever thought that we'd be able to design anything that we did, and this is a picture of it. And one part of the building, which was a student centre for Trondheim, is a piece of the building where the students live, and where you wrap a permanent scaffolding around the otherwise quite sophisticated building, and the students then build out themselves into this scaffolding. The scaffolding is, as it were, a sponge, wrapped, a sponge. If you think of the word sponge, the possibility of absorbency of a sponge, the squeezing in and squeezing up, the open holes of the sponge, it soaks, you can squeeze it and it soaks it in. And the sponge wrapped around the otherwise formality of the centre building. And so this, perhaps, it's post-rationalisation when one starts to get procedural about it. It really came out of the Norwegian scheme, where this quite simply seemed to be rather an interesting idea. And one moved beyond Norway to looking at the sponge conditions of the wrapping. This one, for instance, is called patchwork. The analogy is, I suppose, with that of an old lady making her patchwork quilt. You know how if an old lady makes her patchwork quilt, she collects bits of tweed, and then she collects bits of sort of green material, whether it's hessian or silk or whatever, and she decides in some curious way whether the consistency of that part of the patchwork will be green, or whether the consistency for that part of the patchwork will be tweed, and in fact here the suggestion is that a part of the sponge edge can be built up in the manner of a patchwork, so that the architecture just fills itself in as it will, or in some kind of rather, some other disciplined systems than those which we normally adapt. There are other sort of funny references, references to early archigram, descaling, radicalism, and certain kind of sculpture which already does it. This patchwork, Louise Nevelson, who is in a sense a patchwork artist herself. Anyhow, you get the point, I hope. And this patchwork thing, in a sense, is the most architectural of the sponge conditions so far. It has a system which is that the hard architecture thins up towards the edge, and then it is patchworked in. Because it sometimes gets a bit weird. I found myself, again, the drawing takes over, maybe one finds that, okay, this is ordinary patchworking, slightly trompe-l'oeil, recherché, formalised, lumpen, and then what the hell is that? Because the thing has taken over. The system is only interesting so far as it is needed, and then the building itself has taken over. It's made its own metamorphosis, perhaps. You see, what bores me about things like Aldo Rossi is that I cannot, having said all this, I cannot help myself wanting to make more of this classical situation than he has. I keep thinking, well, yes, that's fair enough. Now, once you've got this, good heavens and good heavens, my goodness, and he's missing the point. Even if the point is to do that, but it's a matrix from which an opportunity to actually make a real building might come. Eat his way, Aldo, for goodness sake. Make the shadow wrong, for Christ's sake, Take that out. What happens then? So, symbolically, this is the hard architecture, which might be an existing building or might be built as such with the sponge condition. Funnily enough, it's the first drawing that one drew, so one was guessing ahead of its drawing. One was saying some parts of it will be elastic, some will be regular, some will have orifices, some will latch onto the core of the thing, some will be quite independent, some will be very sponge-like. I'll probably redraw that one soon, I think. Hard architecture in the centre. Architecture, as has often been pointed out. Freudian slip. Drawn on Christmas Day, so maybe that's sort of why I left. The sponge condition could contain pockets of much more uptight architecture. If this thing is going to be very ambivalent and very spongy, then perhaps there are occasions when there is a need for something more definite. I suppose in our early days we would have called those things capsules. But in this case they are places of a very particular kind. And of course here again the drawing is anticipating the extreme difference of the nature between the hard architecture in the middle, ordinary architecture as we know and build it, and sponge architecture, the slightly expressionist thing on the edge, maybe. And capsules that aren't really like the original capsules that we had. At this point, I'm in a discussion of the degree of classicism, or the degree of control of one's procedure. In order to break the boundaries, you need a baseline. I'm fascinated by attempts that are made to actually break the procedural baseline of drawings, of analyses. All the time one wants to see things like choreography. I mean, I'm fascinated by the possibility of an architecture that is designed by way of choreographic means rather than just static plans, sections, and factors. And this came about a long time ago. If you remember, again in the early stuff we showed you, there were some drawings of the control and choice dwelling that showed the family, and then showed the bits and pieces attempting to respond to the family. And that, even at that early point, 1967, we were desperately wanting a language of analysis and of designing that had extra dimensions to it, that could absorb not only movement, but could absorb the interplay back and forth between conditions of placement, conditions of tension, atmosphere, and this is somebody doing sort of musical thing, and then somehow the final hardware. There's another person whose slide I've lost called Johannes Uhl, who's a German architect who has also attempted this business of a sort of choreographic approach to the problem. I just mention that in passing on this question of classicism. Sibelius, apart from just liking it at the sort of gut level, I've always found fascinating because Sibelius broke that same stranglehold in his own way. He assembled many of his symphonies by a scattering of little bits of information, little bits of anticipatory information, which at a later point in the same work would be drawn together. Quite the antithesis of the classical procedure, where the framework was established and then varied upon. This scatter technique and the ambiguity that it sets up, that you don't know whether certain fragments will or will not come together, one can't help oneself, you see, breaking the things you start off with. So on the right-hand part of the sleep drawing, you find the natural growth eating into the sleep thing, the antithesis, cancerously fighting it. And one finds that for me, the only point of having a classical system, a discipline, a set of literacy in order to push it to the point at which it will disintegrate. Not quite over that line, but fragilely close to that line. And this is really, to me, at a designing level, what architecture is about. The business of taking the rules, the systems, the procedures, the culture, which for me is very important, and then pushing it almost to breaking point. Without it, you're just flaying and trying to break everything, but with it, staying so tight inside it also. So this, which is the last drawing so far done of the sponge, is in fact the fragmentation of a sleek surface, of the outside surface. And perhaps it is the secret garden revisited. This, maybe it's an office block, maybe it's just this very strange artificial architecture going on and on. Once you've just begun to say, okay, this is this thing, then you tear it, you cut it, and there's a memory of something past. And on the drawing, I'm reminded of things like this, which is my favorite building. Or it could be, perhaps it's a building inside there, you know? Why not? And so one tries a series of different cuts, which have growths perhaps, or perhaps they have alternative things going on in this strange fissure. Perhaps they have requotes of one's own preference of architecture. Perhaps they're just cuts that the sleek architecture just wraps around it and goes on. So they say, oh. Or perhaps they're requotes of an architecture that doesn't have to have this consistency, that is itself torn between vegetation and formal architecture, so that it's a sort of mini architecture requoted inside the ongoing larger building. I'm told this is a device that was actually used by certain Baroque architects. Almost at the end now. One of the things that really intrigues me, and it's an extension of this same breaking of the rules, but not by you yourself in a kind of inventive way, but clever and sophisticated, a very strange thing to do in the middle of the Southern Californian desert. But because of the effect of time, when Schindler designed this, we saw a brochure when we were there that showed a picture of this thing sitting in the desert all around it. They were just these strange apartments in the middle of the desert. But in 50 years or whatever it is, time has taken over, the culture of the place has taken over, the creeper, the damp, the vegetation has taken over, and it not only is it inhabited by eccentrics, but the quaintness and the dampness and the slight bit of glass coming out, and the ability of the concrete to survive despite flaking. The patina, a word which we use in discussing pewter or old bits of metal or a copper roof, the patina of architecture is something that fascinates. And whether Schindler was as intriguing as one hopes he was in anticipating this. Certainly in some of his buildings one sees how he is almost my ideal type of architect, because he did really think on his feet. He was highly inventive. He used crummy old building paper if nothing else was available. He tried to do spooky things. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't. And yet there was an underlying discipline of a certain kind of classicism underlying it, from which he broke away, bent the rules, bent practically until they disintegrated. What fascinates me also is the juxtaposition of this slide with the next one, which is an old David Green find somewhere in a Nottingham back garden. Because in this funny way, arguing against myself perhaps, what is the difference between this and the Schindler work? Dennis, could you just flip back? I mean, in a sense, it has many of the same qualities. The Schindler building has a plus because I like this proportion of windows. That's the answer. Or the Schindler building has a plus because it very consciously does something with the roof which anticipates different use of building in the summers from that in the winter. Is that it? Or this is charming because it has loin loom chairs. We'll go back to the next one. And yet the effect of patina, the effect of mixtures of system and inconsequentiality and growth over it, has the same sort of lump in the throat somehow. And that, of course, undermines half of my argument, which I enjoy also. In the final slide, which is a repeat, what intrigues me most is the possibility at this moment of the orifice, the opening in the building, being the wall and the opening at the same time, that the opening might somehow just occur, just as the window would be an incidental part of an intangible change of surface. These sorts of things intrigue me, and I suppose that at this moment, whether it has anything to do with the first hour that you saw, I don't know, and I don't really care. I thought you might like to know what happened in the song of the guy who took his girl to the dance.